Angela stood in the courtroom, holding up a paper. "This is my degree from Harvard Law," she said, her voice cutting through the silence. Judge Holloway's face turned pale as gasps filled the room. "And this," she added, "proves your ruling was based on fraud." The judge's hand trembled. He had no idea who he was dealing with. What happened next left everyone speechless. Angela Davis walked into the grand courtroom, the heavy oak doors closing behind her with a low thud. The sound echoed off the tall marble walls, amplifying the sudden silence that settled over the room like a heavy fog. Heads turned as she stepped forward, heels clicking sharply against the polished floor. The tension in the air was palpable, the kind that coils in your chest and makes it hard to breathe. Angela felt the weight of every gaze on her, some curious, some judgmental, but most of them dismissive. She wasn't surprised. Angela was a black woman in her early 30s, with smooth brown skin and natural curls framing her face. Her sharp navy blue suit fit her slender figure perfectly, the crisp lines giving her a commanding presence despite the storm swirling beneath her calm exterior. Her dark brown eyes were focused and unwavering as she scanned the room, taking in the layout and the faces of those present. The prosecutor, the bailiff, the clerk, the jury, and most importantly, the judge. Judge Raymond Holloway. He sat elevated behind the massive dark wood bench, his tall frame partially hidden behind a row of heavy leather-bound law books. Holloway was a white man in his early 60s, with thinning gray hair combed back neatly and cold blue eyes that seemed to cut through anyone who stood before him. His mouth twisted into a faint, almost amused smile as he watched Angela approach the defendant's table. Angela could feel the judgment radiating from him even before he spoke. It wasn't just that she was representing herself, it was that she was standing before him. A black woman. Alone. Confident. And that clearly made Judge Holloway uncomfortable. Angela calmly placed her leather notebook on the table and sat down. She adjusted her suit jacket and straightened her posture, refusing to let any discomfort show on her face. Judge Holloway's gaze lingered on her for a moment before he finally spoke. His voice was deep, carrying the weight of authority and condescension. "Name?" he barked. Angela didn't flinch. "Angela Davis." The judge's eyebrow lifted slightly. His mouth curled into something resembling a smirk. "And you're representing yourself?" His tone was laced with thinly veiled disdain, as though the very idea of Angela standing before him, alone, without a lawyer, was absurd. "Yes," Angela replied evenly. The judge let out a quiet laugh, not loud enough for the courtroom to react, but just enough for Angela to catch it. "Well," Holloway said, leaning back slightly in his chair, "this should be entertaining." Angela's jaw tightened. Her gaze didn't waver. She was used to this. The underestimation, the dismissal, the subtle and not so subtle racism. But that didn't mean it didn't sting. She had learned long ago that people like Holloway expected her to fold under pressure, to stumble, to fail. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction. The prosecutor, David Collin, sat at the opposite table, adjusting his tie as he watched the exchange with thinly veiled amusement. He was young, clean-cut, with sharp features and a relaxed confidence that came from knowing the odds were on his side. Angela could feel his smugness radiating across the room. Judge Holloway's eyes narrowed. "I assume you understand the nature of these proceedings." Angela's lips pressed into a thin line. "Of course." Judge Holloway's mouth twitched slightly. He leaned forward, his elbows resting on the edge of his desk. "And tell me," he said, his voice low, "what exactly qualifies you to stand before this court?" Angela's brow furrowed slightly. "Excuse me?" "It's a simple question." The judge smiled faintly. "You're claiming to represent yourself in a contract dispute worth several $1 million. That's ambitious. So I ask again, What qualifies you to make that claim? Angela's hand tightened around the edge of her notebook. Her heartbeat quickened, but her face remained calm. My qualifications, she said evenly, are not relevant to the facts of this case. Oh, but they are, Judge Holloway said. His smile widened as though he'd just caught her in a trap. Because if you're wrong, if this turns out to be some baseless accusation, then the consequences could be severe. Angela lifted her chin. I understand the consequences. The judge studied her for a long moment. His smile never faded. Then, by all means, continue. Angela turned toward the jury. Most of them looked uneasy, already sensing the tension in the room. A few of them, the older white men, were clearly amused. One of them leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, a thin smile tugging at his lips. Angela's eyes darkened. She had expected this. She had prepared for it. But the weight of it, the quiet, systematic way they dismissed her, still burned beneath her skin. Her father had always warned her about people like Judge Holloway. They'll look at you and see your skin before they see your mind, he'd said. And they'll wait for you to make a mistake. They'll expect you to fail. Angela's heartbeat steadied. She wasn't going to fail. Judge Holloway sat back in his chair, watching her with thinly veiled amusement. Proceed, he said, waving a hand as though he were granting her permission to speak. Angela stood and walked toward the center of the room. Her heels clicked softly against the marble floor, the sound unnervingly loud in the otherwise silent space. Her back was straight, her shoulders squared. Angela's gaze swept over the room, the prosecutor, the jury, the gallery. She could feel them watching her, weighing her, waiting for her to stumble. Angela's gaze locked with Judge Holloway's. He was smirking again, as if this were all some elaborate joke. Angela smiled faintly. She wasn't going to stumble. She reached into her notebook and pulled out the first sheet of paper. She glanced toward the judge's bench. Shall we begin? She said calmly. Judge Holloway's smile faded slightly. Angela's hand tightened around the paper. Her heart was steady now. Her father's voice echoed in her mind. They'll expect you to fail. Make sure they remember what happens when you don't. Judge Holloway's eyes narrowed. Proceed, he said again, his voice tight. Angela stepped forward, her eyes sharp and focused. She could feel it. The weight of the moment pressing down on her chest, the quiet rage simmering beneath the surface. She smiled faintly as the silence deepened around her. This wasn't going to be entertaining. It was going to be a reckoning. Angela's heels clicked softly against the polished marble floor as she walked back toward the defendant's table. Her steps were measured, controlled, but beneath the surface, her blood was boiling. Her hands tightened around her leather notebook as Judge Holloway's condescending smile lingered in the air like a bad smell. The gallery was tense. Some of the spectators exchanged amused glances, clearly entertained by the idea of a black woman trying to argue her own case. Others whispered behind their hands, their expressions ranging from curiosity to outright disdain. Angela could feel the weight of their judgment pressing down on her like a suffocating fog. She slid into her chair and took a slow breath, willing herself to stay calm. She had prepared for this, the subtle racism, the thinly veiled contempt, the attempts to undermine her before she even had the chance to speak, but knowing it was coming didn't make it any easier to swallow. Miss Davis? Judge Holloway's voice broke through her thoughts, sharp and cutting. I believe I told you to proceed. Angela's gaze lifted toward him. I was under the impression that I already had permission, she said evenly. The judge's mouth twitched. His pale blue eyes darkened. Angela stood, holding her notes firmly in one hand. She could feel her heart thudding against her rib cage, but her face remained neutral, calm. The facts of this case are simple, she began, stepping toward the jury. My client signed a contract under the belief that the terms were fair and legally binding, but after reviewing the contract, discrepancies became apparent. Discrepancies? Judge Holloway interrupted, his tone laced with mockery. Yes, Angela said, her gaze sharpened. Alterations made after the fact. Judge Holloway chuckled, shaking his head as though the very idea was laughable. Miss Davis, he said, his voice growing dangerously low. You're accusing one of the most prestigious firms in the state of contract tampering? Angela's eyes narrowed. Yes. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Angela held his gaze. She could feel the room shifting, the amusement in the gallery turning into unease. Judge Holloway's smile widened. That's a bold accusation. Angela stepped closer to the bench. It's not an accusation if I have proof. Judge Holloway's expression darkened. He leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking beneath his weight. And where exactly is this proof? Angela's hand tightened around the edge of her notebook. Her pulse quickened, but she forced her face to remain steady. I'll present it in due time. The judge's eyes narrowed. Miss Davis, he said, his tone hard. This courtroom operates under strict rules of evidence and procedure. If you have something substantial, present it now. Otherwise, I'll strike your statements from the record. Angela's jaw tightened. Your Honor, the evidence will speak for itself, if you'll allow me to proceed without interruption. Judge Holloway's mouth twisted into a cold smile. You're walking a very thin line. Angela's gaze sharpened. I'm aware. David Collin, the opposing counsel, sat at the opposite table, adjusting his tie as he watched the exchange with thinly veiled amusement. He was young, clean-cut, with sharp features and a relaxed confidence that came from knowing the odds were on his side. Angela could feel his smugness radiating across the room. He stood up slowly. Objection, Your Honor, Collin said. His voice was calm and relaxed, like he was discussing the weather. Miss Davis is making inflammatory statements without providing any concrete evidence. Judge Holloway smiled faintly. Sustained. Angela's brow furrowed. David walked toward the jury, his hands loosely clasped behind his back. He was playing to them now. Miss Davis, David said, turning toward her. Are you implying that my client, one of the most respected firms in this state, knowingly altered legal documents? Angela's gaze didn't waver. I'm not implying anything, she said. I'm stating a fact. David's smile widened. Miss Davis. Judge Holloway's voice cut through the tension. I suggest you tread carefully. Angela's eyes darkened. With all due respect, Your Honor, she said, I suggest you allow me to finish. A ripple of shock passed through the room. Judge Holloway's jaw tightened. His hand curled around the edge of his desk. His pale blue eyes narrowed dangerously. Excuse me? Angela's chest rose and fell steadily. You've interrupted me 3 times, Your Honor, Angela said, her voice sharp but controlled. If you're going to give me permission to present my case, then I suggest you let me finish presenting it. The room fell into a stunned silence. Judge Holloway's lips thinned. His face darkened. He was no longer amused. David stepped toward the judge's bench, lowering his voice slightly. Your Honor, clearly Miss Davis is... Judge Holloway held up a hand. His eyes never left Angela's face. You're very confident for someone representing herself, the judge said. Angela's jaw tightened. Confidence isn't the same as arrogance, Your Honor. Judge Holloway's mouth twitched into a cold smile. We'll see. Angela turned toward the jury. Her heart was still pounding beneath her ribs, but outwardly she was steady, focused. Miss Davis, Judge Holloway said, his voice sharp. "This court does not have time for games." "I'm not playing games," Angela replied, her voice sharpening. "I'm laying out the facts." Judge Holloway leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "If you want to proceed, I suggest you produce something meaningful. Now." Angela's hands tightened around her notes. "Not yet," she said. Judge Holloway's face darkened. "Then sit down." Angela didn't move. "Your Honor," she said evenly, "you'll want to hear what I have to say." Judge Holloway's lips curled into a faint, mocking smile. "We'll see about that," he said. Angela's gaze hardened. She knew exactly what was coming next. Judge Holloway thought he was still in control. He had no idea what was about to happen. Angela took a slow breath and walked back to the defendant's table. She sat down, crossing her legs and resting her hands on her notebook. The gallery was still buzzing with whispered conversations. The jurors' faces reflected a mix of curiosity and skepticism. Angela's gaze flicked toward David Collin. He was still smiling, the picture of smug confidence. Angela's jaw tightened. Let him smile. It wouldn't last. Judge Holloway tapped his gavel once. "Proceed," he said coldly. Angela's eyes sharpened. "Gladly," she said. The game had begun. Angela stood at the center of the courtroom, her hands resting lightly on the table as Judge Holloway stared down at her from the bench. His pale blue eyes were cold and sharp, cutting through the heavy silence like shards of ice. The air in the room was thick with tension. The gallery was deathly quiet. Even the quiet hum of whispers that had filled the room earlier had vanished. Everyone was waiting to see what would happen next. Angela's gaze sharpened. Her heart was pounding beneath her ribs, but outwardly her face remained calm, controlled, steady. "Miss Davis," Judge Holloway's voice cut through the silence, sharp as a knife. "This court has shown you more patience than necessary. If you have actual evidence, present it now, or you can sit down and stop wasting this court's time." Angela's jaw tightened. She stepped toward the bench, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady, "I have already presented enough evidence to warrant further investigation. The discrepancies between the original contract and the altered version," Judge Holloway leaned forward, "are circumstantial at best," he interrupted, his tone flat and dismissive. "It's a weak case, and frankly," his eyes narrowed, "your presentation thus far has done little to convince this court otherwise." Angela's eyes darkened. She could feel it, the heat rising beneath her skin, the slow burn of anger coiling in her chest. David Collin, the opposing counsel, was smirking from his table. He adjusted his tie, his expression practically oozing with smugness. Angela's gaze flicked toward him. "You seem amused, Mr. Collin," she said sharply. David's eyebrows lifted, his smile widened. "Not at all, Miss Davis. I'm just surprised you've made it this far." A low murmur rippled through the gallery. Angela's hands curled into fists at her sides. Judge Holloway sat back in his chair, his mouth twisting into a cold smile. "Frankly, I'm surprised too," he said. Angela's chest tightened. "So," Judge Holloway continued, his tone dripping with condescension, "if you've exhausted your baseless accusations—" "I haven't," Angela interrupted. Gasps rippled through the room. Judge Holloway's smile vanished. His pale blue eyes narrowed dangerously. "Excuse me?" Angela took a step forward, her eyes burning with quiet fury. "You've been interrupting me since I opened my mouth," Angela said, her voice cutting through the heavy silence. "You've mocked me, disrespected me, and ignored the facts laid out in front of you." Judge Holloway's face reddened. "Watch your tone, Miss Davis." Angela's chin lifted. "No," she said, her voice sharpening. You watch yours." The gallery erupted into low whispers. David's smirk faltered. He sat up straighter, his eyes narrowing slightly. Angela's gaze burned into Judge Holloway's. "You have no problem granting the opposing counsel your full attention," she said. "You've given them room to maneuver, to twist the facts, to play the game. But the moment I speak, you interrupt. The moment I present actual evidence, you try to shut me down." Judge Holloway's face darkened. His hand curled around the edge of the bench. "You're out of line," he said coldly. Angela stepped even closer to the bench. "Am I?" she asked. Judge Holloway's lips curled into a thin, dangerous smile. "If you want to press your luck, Miss Davis," he said, his tone dropping into a low growl, "you'll find this court is not nearly as forgiving as you think." Angela's jaw clenched. The heat in her chest was now a full-blown fire, burning through the last of her restraint. "Forgiving?" she repeated. Her voice dropped dangerously low. "You think I need forgiveness?" Judge Holloway's eyes flashed. "You're damn right you do," he hissed. Angela's head tilted slightly. Her mouth curled into the barest hint of a smile. "You should be more careful with your words, Your Honor," she said. "Because once this court hears what I have next, you'll be the one asking for forgiveness." Judge Holloway's hands tightened into fists. "Sit down." Angela didn't move. "I said sit down," Judge Holloway repeated, his voice rising. Angela's gaze didn't flinch. "I'm not finished." David shot to his feet. "Your Honor, this is ridiculous." "Sit down, Mr. Collin," Angela snapped, her voice ringing through the room. David froze. His mouth opened, but nothing came out. Angela's gaze sharpened. "I have the original contract," Angela said. "I have the altered contract, and I have a sworn affidavit from an employee at the defense's firm confirming that the changes were made after the signing." David's face paled. Angela's eyes narrowed. "Would you like me to present that affidavit now?" Judge Holloway's mouth tightened. His eyes darkened. His chest rose and fell sharply beneath his robe. Angela waited. Seconds passed. Finally, the judge's mouth twisted into a bitter smile. "Well," he said, his voice low and dangerous, "it seems Miss Davis has been quite busy." Angela's gaze sharpened. "But you're still forgetting one thing," Judge Holloway continued. "Intent." Angela's eyes narrowed. "Without proof of intent," Holloway said, "this is nothing more than a clerical error. A mistake. Without intent." Angela pulled a small envelope from her briefcase. Judge Holloway's mouth froze mid-sentence. Angela stepped toward the bench and set the envelope down gently in front of him. "What's this?" Holloway asked, his tone sharp. Angela smiled faintly. "Open it." Judge Holloway's gaze hardened. Slowly, he reached for the envelope and slid it open. He pulled out a single sheet of paper. His eyes scanned the contents. Angela watched closely as his face darkened. Judge Holloway's lips thinned. His nostrils flared. "What is this?" he demanded. Angela's voice was sharp. "An internal email from the defense's firm. It outlines the exact changes made to the contract, and when they were made." Judge Holloway's gaze shot toward David Collin. David's face was bloodless. His hands curled into fists. "Miss Davis," Holloway said tightly, "where did you get this?" Angela smiled faintly. "You'll find out soon enough." Judge Holloway's eyes burned into hers. His breathing quickened. Angela took a step back. "Shall I continue?" she asked calmly. Judge Holloway's mouth pressed into a thin line. His jaw tightened. "Proceed," he said through gritted teeth. Angela's smile widened. She turned toward the jury, her posture straight, her head high. "I told you," she said. "The facts speak for themselves." Angela walked back toward the defendant's table. She could feel the weight of every gaze in the room following her. David's eyes burned into her back, but she didn't care. Angela sat down, her expression calm, controlled. David leaned toward his co-counsel, whispering frantically. Judge Holloway's hand tightened around the edge of his desk. His knuckles were white. Angela's eyes glinted with quiet fury. She had the room now, and they all knew it. Angela sat at the defendant's table, her hands folded neatly over her notebook as Judge Holloway's sharp gaze burned into her from across the bench. His pale blue eyes were hard and calculating, his mouth pressed into a thin line. The tension in the courtroom was suffocating. The gallery was dead silent. No one dared to whisper or shift in their seats. The air felt heavy, as though the room itself was holding its breath. Judge Holloway's hand curled around the edge of his desk, his knuckles white against the dark wood. His lips parted, but no sound came out at first. He was furious, not just at Angela's audacity, but at the fact that she wasn't backing down. Angela's gaze remained steady, calm, unflinching. Judge Holloway leaned forward. "Miss Davis," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Do you realize what you're doing?" Angela's chin lifted slightly. "Yes," she said. Judge Holloway's eyes narrowed dangerously. "Then you must know that this course of action is reckless. Presenting that email without verification, suggesting that the defense knowingly altered the contract, it's reckless." Angela's eyes didn't waver. "Reckless?" Her voice sharpened. "Or inconvenient?" Judge Holloway's mouth curled into a cold smile. "You think you've got control of this room?" His voice dropped even lower. "You think you can manipulate this court with arrogance and bravado?" Angela's brow lifted. "I'm not manipulating anything," she said. "I'm laying out the facts." Judge Holloway's smile faded. David Collins stood abruptly from his seat, his face pale but his expression hard. "Your Honor, this is outrageous. My client—" Angela cut him off. "Your client," she said coldly, "is lucky I haven't filed for criminal charges yet." David's face darkened. His jaw tightened. Judge Holloway slammed his gavel against the bench. "Enough!" His voice echoed off the marble walls. Angela didn't flinch. Judge Holloway's eyes darkened. "You are testing my patience, Miss Davis." Angela stood. Her heels clicked softly against the marble floor as she stepped toward the bench. "Good," she said. Judge Holloway's eyes narrowed. "Excuse me?" Angela's expression hardened. "If you're uncomfortable," she said, "that means I'm finally getting somewhere." Judge Holloway's mouth tightened into a thin line. "Miss Davis?" Angela's hand shot up. "No!" The gallery gasped. Angela's eyes sharpened. "You don't get to silence me," she said, her voice rising. "You don't get to mock me, interrupt me, and dismiss me while allowing the defense to manipulate this courtroom without consequence." Judge Holloway's face reddened. His hand clenched around the gavel. "You are out of line," he growled. Angela stepped closer. "You're afraid," she said. Her tone was sharp, cutting through the air like glass. Judge Holloway's jaw tightened. Angela's lips curled into a cold smile. "You know I'm right." Judge Holloway's mouth twitched. "Sit down." Angela didn't move. "You want me to sit down because you know exactly where this is heading," Angela said. "You know that once this evidence is on record, once the jury hears the truth, this case is over." Judge Holloway's hand curled around the gavel. His chest rose and fell sharply beneath his robe. "You are walking on very thin ice," he hissed. Angela's eyes glinted. "Then I suggest you step carefully," she said. Judge Holloway's mouth twisted into a bitter smile. "I could hold you in contempt of court," he said. "Right here, right now." Angela's smile didn't fade. "You could," she said, "but you won't." Judge Holloway's eyes narrowed. "And why is that?" Angela's gaze sharpened. "Because," she said, "you don't want to explain to the state bar why you threw out a case after direct evidence of forgery was presented in open court." Judge Holloway's face darkened. His hand flexed over the gavel. David stood up again. "Your Honor." Angela's gaze shot toward him. "Sit down," she said. David's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Slowly, he sat back down. Angela stepped toward the bench, her eyes burning with quiet fury. "I have a sworn affidavit from an employee at the defense firm confirming that the changes to the contract were made after the fact," Angela said. "I have internal emails proving that the partners at the firm discussed those changes before the contract was submitted to my client." Judge Holloway's eyes flashed dangerously. "You're bluffing," he said. Angela smiled faintly. "Am I?" Angela opened her briefcase and pulled out a folder. She held it up. "These are copies of those emails," she said. "Authenticated and time-stamped." Judge Holloway's mouth tightened. His eyes flicked toward David Collin. David's face had gone pale. His hands curled into fists on the table. His co-counsel leaned toward him, whispering frantically. Angela opened the folder and placed the emails on the judge's bench. "I would suggest," Angela said evenly, "that you take a good look at those before you accuse me of bluffing." Judge Holloway's face paled. Angela stepped back, her arms crossed over her chest. Judge Holloway's eyes scanned the emails. His mouth thinned into a tight line. Slowly, his face darkened. Angela's gaze sharpened. "I assume this meets the standard for direct evidence?" she asked coolly. Judge Holloway's eyes lifted toward her. His jaw flexed. Angela's smile didn't fade. "Or would you like to strike it from the record?" she added. Judge Holloway's mouth opened, but nothing came out. His breathing sharpened. His knuckles whitened against the bench. Angela turned toward the jury. "As you can see," she said calmly, "the evidence is clear. The defense knowingly altered the contract. They committed fraud." Judge Holloway's mouth twisted. His eyes burned into her face. Angela turned back toward him. "Your Honor?" she said softly. Judge Holloway's eyes narrowed dangerously. His chest rose and fell. Angela stepped closer to the bench. "Do you have a ruling?" she asked. Judge Holloway's jaw tightened. His eyes flicked toward David, then toward the jury. Slowly, his hand curled around the gavel. "Proceed," he said through gritted teeth. Angela's eyes flashed with quiet triumph. "Thank you," she said softly. She turned and walked back toward the defendant's table. Her heels clicked softly against the marble floor. David's face was white. His co-counsel was whispering frantically in his ear. Angela sat down, folding her hands calmly on the table. Her face was composed, but beneath the surface her blood was still burning. Judge Holloway's face was a mask of cold fury. His hand flexed around the gavel. His eyes never left Angela's face. Angela's gaze sharpened. She wasn't finished, not even close. Angela sat at the defendant's table, her hands folded over her notebook as the weight of the courtroom pressed down on her. The air was electric, charged with tension so thick it felt like the entire room was holding its breath. Every eye in the gallery was glued to her, waiting for what would happen next. Judge Holloway's pale blue eyes burned into her face from across the bench. His mouth was pressed into a thin line, his knuckles white as he gripped the handle of his gavel. His face was carefully composed, but Angela could see the tightness in his jaw, the stiffness in his shoulders. He was angry, furious, but beneath that was something else. Fear. Angela leaned back slightly in her chair, keeping her expression neutral. Calm. Controlled. David Collin, the opposing counsel, sat at the other table, his face drained of color. His co-counsel was whispering frantically in his ear, but David didn't react. His eyes were fixed on the stack of papers sitting on Judge Holloway's desk, the authenticated emails Angela had just submitted. Judge Holloway's eyes dropped toward the documents. His hand hovered over them for a moment before he finally picked them up and began scanning the contents. His mouth twisted as he read. Angela watched him carefully. The room was completely silent. Even the jury sat frozen, their eyes darting between Angela and the judge. Angela's voice cut through the silence like a knife. "Your Honor," she said smoothly, "would you like me to summarize the contents for the court?" Judge Holloway's eyes flicked toward her, sharp and cold. "That won't be necessary," he said through gritted teeth. Angela's smile didn't fade. "Are you sure?" Judge Holloway's jaw tightened. He set the papers down with a sharp sound that echoed through the courtroom. "I've read enough." Angela's gaze sharpened. "Then I assume you see the problem." Judge Holloway's mouth twisted. His eyes darkened dangerously. "What I see," he said slowly, "is a claim that has yet to be proven." Angela's brow lifted. "Claim?" she repeated. Judge Holloway's eyes narrowed. "The emails suggest misconduct," he said, his tone growing hard, "but they do not constitute proof of criminal intent." Angela's smile widened. "I'm glad you said that, Your Honor," she said. Judge Holloway's brow furrowed. "Excuse me?" Angela pulled another document from her briefcase. It was sealed in an envelope. The seal was unbroken. She placed it on the table. "What's this?" Judge Holloway demanded. Angela stood and walked toward the bench. Her heels clicked softly against the floor. "This," Angela said, "is a deposition from Mark Ellison, a former junior associate at the defense's firm." David's face went white. His co-counsel's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Judge Holloway's eyes darkened. "You have a sworn statement?" Angela nodded. "Mr. Ellison was present during a meeting between the senior partners at the firm. He witnessed them discussing the need to alter the terms of the contract after my client had already signed it." Judge Holloway's hand flexed over the gavel. "That's not—" Angela held up a hand. "Mr. Ellison also stated that the alterations were made specifically to increase the financial penalties in case my client sought early termination." David shot to his feet. "Objection!" Angela's gaze snapped toward him. "On what grounds?" David's mouth opened, but no sound came out. He sat back down slowly. His hands curled into fists. Judge Holloway's lips pressed into a thin line. His eyes were cold and hard as steel. "This," he said, "is a serious allegation." Angela's gaze sharpened. "It's more than an allegation," she said. "It's a fact." Judge Holloway's hand curled around the handle of his gavel. "I will need to see that deposition," he said tightly. Angela smiled faintly. "Of course." She handed the sealed envelope to the bailiff, who delivered it to the judge. Judge Holloway opened the envelope and pulled out the deposition. His eyes scanned the document, his mouth tightening with every word. His face darkened as he read through it. Angela watched him carefully. After a long moment, Judge Holloway set the document down. His hand flexed over the gavel. "Miss Davis," he said, his voice dangerously low, "do you realize what this means?" Angela's eyes flashed. "I do." Judge Holloway's mouth twisted. "And yet you sat on this evidence until now?" Angela's expression hardened. "I wanted to give the defense the opportunity to clarify the discrepancies themselves," she said. "They chose not to." Judge Holloway's gaze cut toward David Collin. David's face was ghostly white. His jaw was clenched so tightly it looked painful. Angela's gaze sharpened. "And now that the truth is on record," Angela said, "the question becomes, what are you going to do about it?" Judge Holloway's eyes burned into hers. "You're walking a very dangerous path, Miss Davis." Angela's mouth curled into a small smile. "No," she said softly. "I'm clearing the path." Judge Holloway's knuckles whitened around the gavel. David stood again, his movements sharp and jerky. "Your Honor," he said quickly, "this evidence was submitted at the last minute." Angela's gaze sharpened. "The defense had every opportunity to disclose this information," Angela said. "They chose not to." Judge Holloway's mouth tightened. His hand flexed over the gavel. His eyes burned into Angela's face. Angela's voice was calm, steady. "My client was deliberately misled," she said. "The defense engaged in contract fraud. The evidence is clear. The deposition confirms it." Judge Holloway's breathing sharpened. His face darkened. Angela stepped toward the jury. Her gaze swept over them, calm and measured. "My client signed that contract in good faith," she said. "The defense manipulated the terms after the fact, knowing full well that my client had neither the legal expertise nor the resources to challenge them." Angela's gaze locked on the jury. "But that's why we have a legal system," she said, "to protect the vulnerable from the powerful." Judge Holloway's hand curled around the gavel. "You're very confident," he said. Angela's eyes didn't flinch. "I have every reason to be." Judge Holloway's lips thinned. His chest rose and fell sharply beneath his robe. Angela stepped back toward her table. "I've presented my case," she said. "I've submitted direct evidence of fraud. The deposition confirms intent." Angela sat down. Judge Holloway's face was cold and hard as stone. His gaze flicked toward David Collin, who sat frozen, his face pale. Angela's eyes sharpened. "And now," she said, "I'm waiting for your ruling." Judge Holloway's jaw flexed. His eyes burned into hers. Seconds passed. The room was deathly quiet. Finally, Judge Holloway's hand flexed over the gavel. He lifted it slowly. Angela's chest rose and fell steadily. Judge Holloway's eyes narrowed. "Proceed," he said through clenched teeth. Angela's smile widened. Judge Holloway slammed the gavel down. "This court is in recess," he growled. Angela stood as the courtroom erupted into chaos. Reporters were already pushing toward the doors. David Collin was speaking urgently to his co-counsel. Judge Holloway turned and stormed toward his chambers without a word. Angela calmly gathered her papers. She walked toward the gallery, her heels clicking softly against the floor. David's eyes followed her. His face was bloodless. Angela's smile didn't fade. She had them now, and they all knew it. Angela stood at the defendant's table, her hands resting lightly on the cool surface as the courtroom erupted into chaos. Reporters were already pressing toward the doors, some frantically scribbling notes, others speaking rapidly into microphones. The low hum of whispers and gasps from the gallery swelled into a steady roar. Judge Holloway stood at the bench, his face pale and taut with tension. His hand still gripped the gavel tightly, the veins in his wrist standing out beneath his thin skin. His eyes burned into Angela from across the room, sharp, cold, and calculating. Angela's expression remained composed, outwardly calm, but beneath the surface, her blood was humming with adrenaline. David Collin was on his feet now, speaking rapidly to his co-counsel, who was frantically flipping through a stack of papers. His face was pale, his mouth tight. Gone was the smug confidence that had defined him earlier in the trial. Now he looked cornered. Angela's gaze flicked toward him. "Good." Judge Holloway slammed his gavel down hard. "Order!" he shouted. The courtroom quieted, but the tension remained thick in the air. Judge Holloway's cold gaze shifted toward Angela. "Miss Davis," he said, his voice low and dangerous, "approach the bench." Angela's gaze sharpened. Slowly, deliberately, she stood and walked toward the bench, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor. She stopped just short of the bench and met Judge Holloway's gaze head-on. The judge leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "You think you've won?" he said quietly. Angela's brow lifted. "I think I presented facts," she said. Judge Holloway's pale blue eyes darkened. "You've backed this court into a corner," he said. His tone was dangerous now, cutting. "You think exposing this misconduct will make you untouchable?" Angela's chin lifted. "I don't need to be untouchable," she said. "I just need the truth on record." Judge Holloway's jaw tightened. "This court does not respond well to public humiliation," he said, his voice cold. "You've embarrassed this institution, and if you think that won't have consequences—" Angela leaned in slightly. "Are you threatening me, Your Honor?" Judge Holloway's mouth twisted into a thin smile. "I'm warning you," he said. Angela's eyes narrowed. "Good," she said softly, "because that means you're worried." Judge Holloway's smile vanished. His eyes flashed dangerously. "You think you've won?" he repeated. Angela's expression sharpened. "No," she said, "but I'm about to." Judge Holloway's eyes darkened. "You're walking a very dangerous line." Angela smiled faintly. "I know." Judge Holloway straightened. His hand curled around the handle of his gavel. "Return to your seat," he said coldly. Angela turned and walked back toward the defendant's table. Her gaze flicked toward David Collin as she passed his table. His eyes narrowed. His mouth tightened. He was furious. But beneath the rage, Angela could see something else now. Fear. Angela sat down, folding her hands neatly over her notebook. Her eyes remained sharp and focused. Judge Holloway's voice cut through the tension like a knife. "Mr. Collin," he said, "do you have anything to say in response to this new evidence?" David stood, his mouth tightening. He took a breath, but Angela could see the tension in his shoulders, the hesitation in his movements. He was scrambling. David adjusted his tie and stepped toward the jury box. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began smoothly, his voice regaining some of its former confidence. "What we've seen here today is nothing more than a miscommunication. Yes, there were adjustments to the contract, but—" Angela stood. "Objection?" David's eyes narrowed. "On what grounds?" Angela's voice sharpened. "Misrepresentation of evidence." David's mouth curled into a thin smile. "You can't object to a closing statement." Angela stepped toward the jury box. "I can when the statement is deliberately misleading," she said. David's smile faded. "This is ridiculous," he said. "You can't." Angela's eyes darkened. "Shall I read from the deposition?" David's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Angela held up the sworn affidavit. "Shall I remind the jury of Mark Ellison's statement, where he confirmed that the alterations were made after the contract was signed?" David's jaw tightened. "That doesn't prove criminal intent." Angela's eyes burned. "The internal emails do." David's face flushed red. His hands curled into fists. Angela's gaze sharpened. "The defense knowingly altered the contract to increase the financial penalties," Angela said. "That's fraud." David's face was bloodless now. "Your Honor." Judge Holloway's hand flexed over the gavel. "Sit down, Mr. Collin." David hesitated. His eyes narrowed toward Angela, and for a brief moment his expression darkened into something ugly. Angela's chin lifted. "Come on," she thought. "Give me an excuse." David sat down slowly, his jaw tight. Angela turned toward the jury. "The facts are clear," she said, her voice measured and calm. "The defense altered the contract after my client signed it. They concealed those changes, and then used the altered terms to penalize my client financially. Angela's gaze swept over the jury. "If that's not fraud," she said, "then what is?" Judge Holloway's face was pale. His mouth was drawn into a tight line. His gaze flicked toward David, whose hands were gripping the edge of the table so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. Angela's gaze remained steady. Judge Holloway's mouth twisted. "This court will need time to review the evidence." Angela smiled faintly. "Take all the time you need, Your Honor," she said. "The evidence isn't going anywhere." Judge Holloway's jaw tightened. His hand hovered over the gavel. His chest rose and fell sharply beneath his robe. Angela's gaze sharpened. She could feel it, the balance of power shifting beneath her feet. For the first time since this trial had started, Judge Holloway wasn't in control anymore. Angela stood and gathered her papers. "If that's all," she said calmly, "I believe my case rests." Judge Holloway's mouth curled into a thin, bitter smile. "This court is adjourned," he said. He slammed the gavel down hard. Angela turned toward the gallery. Reporters were already moving toward the exits, murmuring into microphones. David Collins' face was blank. His co-counsel was speaking urgently in his ear, but David wasn't listening. His eyes were locked on Angela. Angela slid her notebook into her briefcase. Her expression remained calm, but beneath the surface, her blood was still burning. Judge Holloway stood, his gaze lingering on Angela for a moment longer before he turned and walked toward his chambers without another word. Angela watched him go. She had forced his hand, and now it was only a matter of time. Angela turned and walked toward the heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom. The gallery parted for her as she passed. Some of the spectators watched her with quiet awe, others with quiet dread. Angela pushed the doors open and stepped into the hallway. She had done it, but it wasn't over yet, not even close. Angela gathered her things and stood. The opposing counsel hurried toward her. "We had no idea you were—" Angela's smile was razor sharp. "No, you didn't." She walked toward the courtroom doors. Reporters were already waiting outside, cameras flashing. "Miss Davis," one of them called, "did you expect to win today?" Angela paused at the top of the courthouse steps. "I never expect to lose," she said. Angela stood at the top of the courthouse steps as the sun broke through the gray clouds. Her client stood beside her, tears in his eyes. "You saved my life," he said. Angela smiled. "Justice saved you." Behind her, Judge Holloway stood at the entrance of the courthouse, his expression dark. He watched as Angela walked away, her head high. A reporter turned toward Judge Holloway. "Judge Holloway, any comments on today's verdict?" The judge's mouth twisted. He turned and walked back inside without a word. Angela walked toward the street, the hum of victory in her veins. Justice had been served, and she had delivered it.